Each of the 4 preceding programmes in this series has dealt with a specific theme. This programme is rather different because, of course, not all the scientific research undertaken in the stress of war was successful. Much of it just failed. Some of it was simply misguided and even bizarre. Some was frustrated by political interference and indecision. And in Germany in particular, political interference has led to some of the great question marks that still hang over the history of the secret war. If Hitler had not curtailed all long-term research in 1940, if jet aircraft had reached German squadron operational service a year earlier, as they might well have done. This programme looks at some of those failures and looks into some of the intriguing things that might have been. In the autumn of 1940, the German people considered that the war was as good as won. Most of Europe, Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and now France, was under German occupation. It was true that Britain remained unconquered, but that was surely only a matter of time. Meanwhile, the troops were coming home. 15 divisions were demobilised. Peace on German terms was at hand, and although the question of the invasion of Britain still remained to be settled, a possible solution to the problem was now in view. In 1940, 41 of these DFS 230 gliders carried assault troops to attack fortifications behind the Belgian lines. The operation was highly successful. This novel form of warfare was to make a profound impression on service chiefs everywhere. But the biggest impression was on the Germans themselves. By the end of 1940, this larger glider, the Gotha 242, could carry 21 fully equipped men, compared with only 10 in the smaller glider. Both gliders were of simple construction, cheaply made, and were considered to be expendable. Now a specification was to be issued for a glider for the postponed invasion of Great Britain. Professor William Messerschmitt himself sketched the design. A giant glider capable of carrying tanks, artillery, or 200 fully armed men. It was to be towed by no fewer than 4 aircraft. Immediately, the company received an order for 200, and in great secrecy, construction began at Leipheim near Ulm, where in just 14 weeks, an army of workers ran up one of the largest aircraft ever built. It was appropriately called Gigant, or Giant, and it was big. With a wingspan of 180 feet, an all-up weight of 40 tons, even today it wouldn't be overshadowed, being only slightly smaller than a jumbo jet. And as the first aircraft was rolled out for flight trials, 11 more were on final assembly, and a further 62 in an advanced state of construction. To accomplish all this in just 14 weeks had been a staggering achievement. The loading of the tanks and guns was tested in a mock-up fuselage, which interestingly was fitted with clamshell doors. These are now common, of course, but they were first designed for use with the Gigant. And although the huge glider was a fabric cupboard aircraft, the floor was stressed to take the heavy armour. To assist the machine to take off, up to 8 rocket units, fueled with hydrogen peroxide, were fitted beneath the wings. Even so, the first flight of the Gigants, carrying a mere 4 tons of brick as ballast, would clearly be a day to remember. It was on the 21st of February 1941 that Flugkapitän Bahr, the pilot, the word somehow seems inadequate, was towed to the mile-long paved runway that was considered necessary. He was seated in a single narrow cockpit some 60 feet above the ground. It must have been just about the loneliest place on Earth as he got the feel of the control surfaces, which were equivalent to the entire wing area of quite a sizable plane. A Junkers 90, one of the few big 4-engine planes the Germans possessed, was used to drag the Gigant along the runway. Then, with the takeoff rockets going full blast, and the Junkers 90 flat out, the enormous glider was airborne for the first time. The first hurdle, dropping the 2-ton undercarriage, was cleared without incident. That first flight, according to German records, lasted just 22 minutes, though it may have seemed rather longer to Herr Bahr. However, he reported that the flight characteristics were good, though he did add that the controls were a bit on the heavy side and suggested that a wider cockpit with a co-pilot to help with the pushing and pulling would make things a bit easier up front. This suggestion was adopted on the 101st glider to be built. The huge glider was brought in for a good landing on its skids, and immediately a shortcoming was apparent. After landing, the 40-ton aircraft was immobile until it was jacked up and the undercarriage was repositioned. However, this wouldn't matter when it was used operationally as an assault glider. Development flights continued, though the captain of the fifth flight, the redoubtable woman test pilot Hannah Reich, struck a somewhat more critical note in her report.
Impossible. It had to be so primitive because it in reality had only to make one flight and then finished. You couldn't bring it back. So it was so primitively built that it was so difficult to fly. You needed so much strength. And you see, this, what is too hard for me in a 5 minutes flight, that is too hard for a strong man in a 1 hour flight. So I tried with this argument to convince Udit to stop it, but he didn't believe it, because Messerschmitt said, she is a too small a little girl, but not a strong man for fighting, so don't believe her.
They didn't. Though it was obvious that the Junkers 90 was underpowered for the towing job. Its crews were reporting that they were barely able to keep a safe flying speed on takeoff, and this with a lightly loaded glider and the rocket assistance. Obviously, a more powerful tug was urgently required. There was a proposal to join together two Heinkel 111 bombers and add a fifth engine. This was named the Zwilling, or Twin. Whilst this unlikely aircraft was being developed, an interim method was adopted, the scheme that Messerschmitt himself had originally sketched out. The use of multiple tow planes. He had proposed 4, but in practice, only 3 were used. They were Messerschmitt 110s with a total of 8,850 horsepower, and every single one of them would be needed. 3 long 10mm steel cables connected the glider to the tow planes, the arrangement going by the name of Troika Schlepp, or triple tow. The takeoff was in many ways difficult. The glider pilot lit the rockets as soon as the Troika started to move. Takeoff drill called for the Gigant to unstick first at around 55 miles an hour indicated. The 2 outer tow planes then left the ground, followed by the leader. The aim was to climb out at 80 miles an hour. With 40 tons behind them, the tow pilots had their hands full. The 110s were hanging on their props near the stall. The slightest drop in engine power could lead to a disaster. And disasters there were. On one test flight, the glider rockets fired on only one side, dragging the Troika together. 129 men, the glider was carrying troops, were killed. The parachutes are not, as one might suppose, the 3-man crew leaving the aircraft, but the burnt-out and reusable takeoff rockets. Hannah Reich, on her second flight, had trouble with the Troika Schlepp takeoff.
The left bomber, even when still being on the ground, or just above the ground, went out. He had to release the cable, and 2 couldn't tow it alone. We had 6 rockets on the wing, which when they once were blowing, you could not stop them. So when you lost one towing bomber, also the right bomber was lost. I was hanging on one bomber that was like a little fly compared with my giant. And all 6 rockets were burning. I knew I couldn't stop it. I could get 150 feet high. Then the rockets were finished after 3 minutes or 4. And I knew the single tow bomber had to release me, otherwise he would. So I could just, when he released me, and I could release all 3 ropes. And so before the ground, I touched the ground. It was like this, but we had the good luck that it was only good luck, touched the ground when the ground makes such a wave. So one had broken his knees, another had a nerve shock, but you see, I was well, and only deeply thankful that nobody was killed, and I finished because I was so much against it, because it was too big.
Russia had now been attacked, and the 200 Gigants were to be used to supply the eastern armies. But the Troika only had a range of 250 miles, and the giant gliders caused unacceptable chaos en route. The delivery of a few Zwilling tugs helped, and some Gigants did make supply flights to the Eastern Front and were used for the evacuation of the wounded. But there was still the problem of getting enough suitable tow planes. So behind the screens at Leipheim, there was a new proposal. Why not make the Gigants self-powered? So 6 Gnome-Larone engines that had recently become surplus to the requirements of the French Air Force were fitted. A wartime German newsreel shows the powered version in use on the Russian front, supplies being loaded, 12 tons of ammunition and guns, and tanks. These happy-looking soldiers were clearly not flying with the Gigant. The troops hated it. They nicknamed the fabric-covered aircraft the sticking plaster bomber. They much preferred to fly within the corrugated metal security of the dear old 3-engined Junkers 52 transport. Gunners formed part of the 11-man crew, which now included flight engineers and 2 pilots, chosen, one would suppose, largely for their strength rather than flying finesse. The Gigant was still flown with manual controls, although a permanent undercarriage had now been fitted, which solved the problems of airfield mobility. The takeoff must have been an impressive sight, and the original German soundtrack is not inappropriate. On the supply routes to Russia, the Germans enjoyed air superiority, so there wasn't much risk, though the passengers on board seemed far from happy. The gunners would be needed on other fronts, however, because in addition to supplying the Eastern Front, the Gigants were also to be used to ferry desperately needed fuel to Rommel's Africa Corps. The fuel was carried in unprotected drums, and the Gigants, lumbering along at 130 miles an hour, were ruthlessly cut down by British fighters. Few survived. The Gigant glider might, at this distance in time, seem an absurd folly, but if the timing of events had been only slightly different, and if the gliders had been used in the role for which they'd been designed, assault, then 200 or so could have landed out of some dawn, just after Dunkirk, with 20,000 troops, 100 tanks and artillery in the Weald of Kent, and little more than the rifles of the Home Guard to contain them. In 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected the defences of the Atlantic Wall in anticipation of the coming Allied invasion. And in preparation for that invasion of Europe, a number of secret weapons were being tested, some of which were to prove that the Germans had no monopoly of follies. This is Argosy, a sort of armoured omnibus. The men on the top deck seemed confident enough, although today its role is rather obscure. Was it perhaps to drive straight to Calais? The wind looks far from fair for France. This trial was codenamed Kapok Landing Stage, a cover name for a Kapok landing stage. A platoon or so of men, clad only in shorts PT, was required to leap into probably mined waters and then, under enemy fire, calmly knock in a mooring post to enable the waiting motorcyclists to land and attack the enemy. But alas, someone seems to have got the tides wrong, or perhaps they simply ran out of Kapok. The Kapok stage never, so far as is known, went into action. Though had it done so, any casualties would have been handled by the newly invented one-man beach stretchers. Meanwhile, the trials of Argosy were proceeding, though in vain. For Argosy, like Aquatow, was never used in anger. Aquatow was seriously proposed to enable a fully equipped soldier to be landed in Normandy, towed by a personal tank. And then there was the giant Panjandrum, huge Catherine wheel crammed with explosives which would propel itself up the beach to the German positions. It's been said, however, that it was a spoof to lead the Germans to think we were landing on the broad, sandy beaches of Calais. Then came Agile, a serious enough proposal to drop supplies without a parachute, using retro rockets to cushion the landing during its trials. The trials of Agile were disappointing. This highly successful weapon, the flail tank, was also tested on English beaches in 1943. Its purpose was to clear mines. It was successfully used in Normandy and elsewhere, saving many lives. Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, also saved lives, since it was used to pump millions of gallons of fuel from secret locations on the south coast to the Normandy beachheads. The pumps, in the basements of these unrepaired bomb buildings in Britain, taking over the work of vulnerable tankers off the beachheads. And troop-carrying gliders that the Germans had hoped to use against Britain were to lead the assault on D-Day, at Arnhem, and in many other theatres. During the Normandy invasion, the Germans were to employ some secret weapons against us. One of them was Marder, a one-man midget submarine carrying a single standard torpedo. The Germans claimed some success for Marder off Normandy, although Allied records cannot confirm this. The captains of full-sized U-boats had to rely on visual observation. Radar would have given away their positions. But the view from the bridge was strictly limited, due to the height of the conning tower above the sea. However, a much more distant horizon could be obtained. On the deck of this U-boat, watertight compartments contained the components of Bachstelze, which was, in knockdown form, a small autogyro. The rotors were not powered, being driven just like a windmill. The small autogyro was towed like a kite behind the U-boat, rapidly climbing to several hundred feet, so that the pilot observer could report possible distant targets. He would then be winched back to the U-boat's deck, although in an emergency, the rotors could be jettisoned and the Bachstelze and its pilot would land by parachute. About 200 of these small autogyros were issued, but increasing Allied anti-submarine aircraft patrols meant they were very little use operationally. The helicopter, with its powered rotors, was little used during the Second World War, though the Germans did have a number under development. This is Kolobin, and it demonstrates an ability to hover, which an autogyro couldn't do. The main shortcoming of these early helicopters was simply they couldn't carry a worthwhile offensive load. The depth charge dropped appears little more lethal than a hand grenade. The Royal Navy tested an autogyro on HMS Massey in 1942 to assess the feasibility of these aircraft operating from the deck of a ship. This it did successfully, but they were never used operationally. The Americans came up with the only Allied helicopter to cease service, the Sikorsky Hoverfly, in late 1944. After the enormous success of the RAF dam-busting raid, another smaller bouncing bomb was developed by Barnes-Wallis. This was Highball. The bombs were dropped from about 50 feet and had a range of about 1 mile. A special RAF squadron, number 618, was formed, flying Mosquitoes to use the weapon, and they trained with practice bombs in Loch Fyne against an old battleship, HMS Malaya. Direct hit. This film was shot in slow motion, and the backspin of the second bomb can clearly be seen. The 1,200-pound practice bomb has gone right through the old warship's hull, though they were in fact designed to sink alongside their targets and explode underwater. 618 Squadron continued to train and were finally sent to the Pacific, but the war ended before they could be used operationally. Much of the bouncing bomb story is well known. What is much less well known is that the Germans had a bouncing bomb too. Codenamed Kurt, it was rocket-powered, the rockets breaking off as it hit the sea. It was about half the size of Highball, but worked on exactly the same principle, skipping over the sea, then sinking to be exploded by a hydrostatic fuse. And if 618 Squadron could drop 2 bouncing bombs, so could the Germans. And this exceedingly rare film shows quite clearly that unlike Highball, Kurt had no backspin. But Kurt, like Highball, never bounced in anger, and the project was cancelled at the end of 1944. Another anti-shipping weapon was a range of rocket or jet-powered boats, filled with high explosives and radio-controlled. Their purpose was to ram enemy vessels, but this one appears to have a fundamental hull design problem. The purpose of the flare is to enable the boat to be guided. Though this one didn't go into action, a later converted E-boat did. But perhaps the most advanced anti-shipping weapon of all was this, the Henschel 293, a small guided missile. Rocket-powered, it was carried under a Heinkel. The method of attack was for the Heinkel to fly to within sight of the target. The tactics, as shown in this wartime training film, were for the parent aircraft to drop the missile about 10 kilometres from the target, and then for an operator to guide it visually. The development flying was from Karlshagen, the Luftwaffe experimental airfield at Peenemünde, as early as the winter of 40-41, and dropping the 293 called for very precise flying. As the missile fell free, the first liquid fuel rocket fired, accelerating the 293 towards its target. In the parent aircraft, the missile was controlled up, down and left, right by radio command. The second stage rocket lit after 14 seconds. By now the small aircraft was at maximum speed, and tracking it visually must have been very difficult. But the curving attack course could clearly be seen as the 293 approaches a practice target on a small island near Uskdum in the Baltic. This film, shot in December 1940, is believed to show only the second trial attack. That test missile carried no warhead, but had the target been a ship, it would undoubtedly have been sunk. The HS-293 was used operationally, though this is a training run against a target ship. It was used against the Royal Navy off Finisterre and in the Mediterranean. They did sink 5 warships, including a cruiser. But the weakness of the weapon was its guidance system, which the Royal Navy easily jammed. To counter this, the Germans had a proposal to fly it by wire, thin wires spooled out from the wingtips. But this never went into production. Another refinement, years ahead of its time, was to control the bomb by television. An airborne receiver and a miniature iconoscope tube was developed for the purpose. Though tested, it was never used operationally. At the Photographic Reconnaissance Headquarters, RAF Medmerham, they watched German airfield for signs of new aircraft. One of the most skillful aircraft photographic interpreters was a WAF officer, Constance Babington Smith.
5 Ju-52s and quite a lot of 109s.
Good. Well, let me see it, will you, when you're finished?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
One of the places I used to very much enjoy looking for aircraft was Rechlin, which was the equivalent of our Farnborough, the German Farnborough. And one never knew what one was going to find there. I once saw an American Fortress, B-17, which evidently they were using for their own sort of research there.
By 1943, the photographic interpreters had been briefed to look for signs of German jet or rocket-propelled aircraft.
Very good cover taken of Peenemünde in spring of 1943. There were 3 of these strange little tailless aircraft. And then subsequently I saw several more of them there, and it was at Peenemünde I first saw the marks which the rocket exhaust made by scorching the grass before the plane took off.
The small planes were Messerschmitt 163s, at that time, 1943, being evaluated for the Luftwaffe. Designed as interceptor fighters, these small delta-wing aircraft were rocket-powered, with an unbelievable rate of climb and a top speed almost twice that of contemporary Allied fighters. But they could only burn their rockets for a few minutes. The prototype, the 163A, was designed by Alexander Lippisch in 1941, based on an earlier delta-wing glider. A small Walter liquid-fueled rocket powered the plane, developing over 3,000 pounds of thrust. Flight trials at Peenemünde started in August 1941, the rocket plane taking off from the grass airfield without difficulty. To save weight, the undercarriage was jettisoned, the landing being made on skids. And from the very earliest flights, the climbing power of the small plane was phenomenal. After the rocket fuel ran out, the 163 glided back to a landing. The test pilot of those early trial flights, Heini Dietmar, was so impressed with the performance of the 163 that he was confident he could easily break the existing world speed record. The aircraft was towed to a height of 13,000 feet and the rocket fired. In level flight, it achieved a speed of 623 miles an hour, almost twice that of the fastest contemporary fighters and nudging the sound barrier. And although this, of course, was not revealed at the time, Dietmar did receive a discreet award for this record-breaking flight. A military version was built in the summer of '42, the B or Beta model. The big snag was the fuel used. Coded C-Stoff and T-Stoff, they were basically methanol alcohol and hydrogen peroxide, and highly incompatible. A few drops could cause a violent reaction. T-Stoff alone was capable of spontaneous combustion when in contact with any organic material. That, of course, included the pilot. Even ground running a 163 was not without danger. The engine was started by introducing a small quantity of potassium permanganate into the hydrogen peroxide. The steam produced drove the turbine fuel pumps. When the pressures were correct, the throttle was gingerly opened. The water was essential to prevent any unburnt fuel exploding. Fortunately, both these unstable chemicals were soluble in water. To protect the pilots, a special suit of acid-resistant material was issued. Without this protection, they could quite literally be dissolved by the fuels. The pilots, who were all volunteers, breathed oxygen for the whole flight. The remarkable Hannah Reich flew an early 163.
I was only flying the 163A model and made 4 sharp rocket flights. And I can only tell you, it was fascinating. It was like thundering through the skies, sitting on a cannonball, like being intoxicated by speed. It was not difficult to fly it. It was only an overwhelming impression. At the end of the airfield, or the airfield boundary, you already reached about 500 miles per hour, and with constant speed, you were climbing up in 1.5 to 2 minutes into a height of 30,000 feet. The landing was difficult because it was aerodynamical so excellent that you had to take away the speed early enough for the landing and to touch the ground exactly at the threshold.
Even a good landing could be dangerous. Several planes with unburnt fuel blew up on touchdown, and several just blew up. There were disagreements between Alexander Lippisch and the Messerschmitt Company, and difficulties in fitting armaments. And so it wasn't until May 1944 that the first production 163s, now called the Comet, were delivered to the Luftwaffe. But German engineers had been working since the late 1930s on a true jet turbine. And in 1939, the world's first jet-propelled aircraft, the Heinkel 178, made a short test flight. The Heinkel company followed with the 280, a more practical plane, which, however, didn't go into production due to Hitler's personal directive, made in late 1940, that all long-term research was to be cancelled. The Messerschmitt 262 did go into production, though in very limited numbers, and mainly due to the stubborn insistence of General Adolf Galland after he'd flown the prototype.
My impression was overwhelming, I must really admit, and I remember this very, very well. This was very early in 1943. I flew one of the first prototypes. We had only 2 of them. This first prototype was still sitting on a tail wheel, and with a stick we were not able to lift the tail off. So we had strips marked on the runway, and by reaching these strips we had to use the brakes shortly in order to get this turning movement and to get the tail off. I realized immediately the superiority and the possibilities of these fighters.
Hitler was eventually persuaded. He ordered the 262 to be put into production, but as a bomber. Since it was designed as a fighter, the conversion took time. And that was not the only reason for this superb fighter being late into service.
The delay was only that we didn't start early enough. The development has been stopped, and Hitler didn't see the possibilities. His knowledge about technical developments were very, very limited, especially in aviation.
The story of the British jet engine is also one of delays, caused by ministerial indifference, a lack of facilities, and a chronic shortage of money. The whole project was run on a shoestring by a man of genius, a serving RAF officer, Frank Whittle, who designed and built a jet engine with just a handful of staff.
About 5 or 6 actually on the power jet's payroll. We were borrowing fitters and people from the British Thomson Houston Company, and later on I managed to get 1 or 2 people on loan from the RAF. By at the beginning of 1940, we'd grown to a total of about 25.
Yet on the 15th of May 1941, the Gloucester E-2839, the first British jet, took to the air. It was flown by test pilot Jerry Sayers.
He reached about 370 at 20,000 feet, which was a little bit faster than the Spitfire could do in those days. When Jerry Sayers landed after his first flight, he was delighted. He commented that it was perhaps one of the easiest aeroplane he'd ever had to fly.
Faced with the evidence of this successful flight, the ministry had no real alternative.
They decided to take a gamble and go into production. And they selected for production the Rover Company, because they had shadow factories and they had a good reputation as car manufacturers and so on and so forth. So the Rover Company was given the job of dealing with the production side. Well, they struggled on for quite a long time and weren't getting anywhere. Unfortunately, the decision was taken that Rolls-Royce would take over from them, the jet engine business.
Rolls-Royce, though fully committed to making the Merlin and other piston engines, had been unofficially helping Frank Whittle. Lord Hives of Rolls-Royce, seeing the potential of the jet engine, decided to take the company into a field they were later to dominate.
One day, Hives said to me, "Come on, tonight we're going up to Clitheroe and we're going to have dinner with S.B. Wilkes." That's all he said, so I went with them and we had a pleasant dinner. 5 bob one in those days, but it was still pretty good. And at the end of the dinner, old Hives turned to Wilkes and said, "What are you doing with this jet engine? You don't know anything about aircraft engines. That's our job." I remember he said, "You grub about on the ground." That was another remark he made. He said, "I'll tell you what I'll do." He said, "I'll give you our tank engine factory at Nottingham. You give me this jet job." And Wilkes said, "Done."
So, for an initial cash outlay of 15 shillings, Rolls-Royce entered the jet age, with the Meteor aircraft, powered by the Welland, the Rolls-Royce production version of Frank Whittle's design. The Meteor went into service in July 1944, just in time to intercept the V-1s. It was the only Allied jet to see service during World War II, based in England and later on the continent. It's fair to say that the engine was probably better than the airframe, but the early Meteors did nearly 500 miles an hour. Could these advanced fighters have reached the squadrons earlier than mid-1944?
It would have been possible to have had them 2 years earlier than we did, which was in 1944.
There's no doubt about it that if either Sir Frank had had that sort of effort earlier on, or Rolls had come into the job earlier, we could have got the Meteor in service, I would have said, a couple of years sooner, because there were plenty of airframes, if I remember rightly. It didn't drag at all. They were available.
But for Hitler's personal interference, the German 262 could also have been in service earlier. This excellent fighter was now desperately being produced. It was needed to fight a new enemy that was hammering Germany from British bases. United States 8th Army Air Force. From midsummer 1942, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were to operate against German industrial targets in daylight. Up to 14 heavy machine guns and flew in close box formation, the theory being that this gave each plane greater protection. It was a bold concept, for both the Luftwaffe and the RAF had learned the hard way that flying in daylight against determined fighter opposition was a very costly business indeed. The Americans were to confirm this, for as the raids progressed against the vital industrial targets, the Germans threw all the fighters that they had into the great air battles over Germany. Because they flew in close formation to protect themselves against the fighters on their long bombing run, the American aircraft were easier targets for the flak gunners 5 miles below. This colour film was shot by combat cameramen of the US Army Air Force on an actual raid over Germany, and it gives a graphic illustration of what it must have been like to fly in an American bomber in daylight over Germany in 1943. The fighters close in for the kill. From now on, it's up to the gunners. When flying in formation, there can be no evasive action. The only aid, the intercom.
There's 4 of them, 1 o'clock high. They're coming around. Watch. Two fighters, 6 o'clock up, coming in, diving out, Chief. B-17 in trouble out at 2 o'clock, watching. Got an engine on fire. There's 2 more diving through the 94. 3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boys. 17 out of control at 3 o'clock. Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out. There's one. He come out of the bomb bay. Yeah, I see him. There's a tail gunner coming out. Watch out for fighters. Keep your eye on them, Bill. See any parachutes?
The losses steadily mounted. On one raid on the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt in southern Germany, over 60 American bombers were shot down. And these actual German gun camera records show how closely the attacks were pressed home. The B-24 Liberator. The German fighter pilots came very close to halting the daylight raids. But by late 1943, long-range American fighters, the P-47s and later P-51s, had been developed to escort the bombers all the way to the target. Then it was the turn of the German fighters to become the hunted. As their vital aircraft and armament factories went up in smoke, many German pilots could only wish that the Messerschmitt 262 had been developed faster and made available in greater numbers, because the few that did see action were very successful. The rocket-powered Comet also went into action against the Americans, and this gun camera film records an attack against flying fortresses. The pilot of the Comet was Oberfeld Webel Schubert. He didn't live to repeat his success. He lost his life soon after when his Comet blew up on takeoff for no apparent reason. But from late 1944, the operations of the rocket squadron JG-400 steadily diminished. There was a shortage of pilots due to the endless strafing of the training airfields, and a shortage of rocket fuel because of the incessant bombing of the specialized factories that produced it. The few 262s in service were held in great respect by American pilots. Because of their high speed and maneuverability, they were able to take on the escort fighters without difficulty. One American pilot, Major Ben Drew, flying a P-51 Mustang, managed to shoot down two of them by jumping them as they were taking off.
That engagement taught me a very important lesson that if you couldn't come up with a surprise attack on this 262, if the pilot of the 262 was fully knowledgeable about what you were doing, you were just outclassed. You couldn't stay with him.
My tail gunner called him out at 6 o'clock high, and he said way high. I remember that like it was yesterday. And the next thing we knew, the gunners all started firing, and then he called them out one more time. Here they come, and then they were gone. And three of them came through, and they shot down 3 airplanes. They were quite good.
There was no way to compete with that aircraft, with the aircraft we had at hand, and if the 262 were being flown by qualified pilots, which they were. Had they had sufficient numbers, well, it would have been devastating. That's the only word I can use for it.
I am of the strong opinion that when we would have had the Messerschmitt 262 in numbers available from the beginning of 43, we would have been able to stop the daylight offensive.
It's one of the ifs, but with a few hundreds, only a few hundred jet fighters at hand, possibly the whole disaster the Americans did to me after the 12th of May when they started bombing the synthetic oil plants could have been avoided.
The Germans had developed yet another operational jet, this time the world's first jet bomber, the Arado 234 Blitz, or Lightning. A single-seater, it relied entirely on speed. It flew first in December 1943, but went into action in late 1944, just in time for the Battle of the Bulge. The early prototypes used a small takeoff trolley. With rocket assistance, these aircraft could rapidly climb to their ceiling of over 30,000 feet. Yet strangely, these very advanced aircraft had to rely on a crude skid for landing. Only the later versions were fitted with a conventional tricycle undercarriage. These aircraft were used from late 1944 from French bases to fly high-level reconnaissance sorties over airfields in Great Britain. Other aircraft were also used in the Ardennes winter offensive, although happily for the Allies, in very small numbers. In addition to the jets, the Germans at the war's end had some 90 different types of rocket under development. Many of them were highly advanced ground-to-air missiles, though none was to see active service. If the Germans were able to develop these sophisticated weapons, how close were they to producing an atomic bomb?
It's one of the ironies of history that the whole chances of Germany to have an atomic bomb were spoiled by the fact that Hitler considered the Einstein theories and the atomic research a Jewish physics, as he called it. He was a good friend of him, and a Nobel Prize winner was Professor Leonard. He was an old party member, and he was claiming that all those things are Jewish in the influence, and the consequence that Hitler was considering this Jewish was that nobody would have dared to give support to those people who were Jewish, working under Jewish influence, as Heisenberg and Hahn. And this was one of the reasons that we haven't had any cyclotron or anything else. And it was one of the reasons that the advance we had in the atomic research before the war, in the beginning of the war, was absolutely neglected and was not used.
Following the defeat of Hitler's Germany, there is another question. Another if, which has remained unanswered for over 30 years. The question is this: if we had not broken the German Enigma codes, would it have made a significant difference to the conduct or indeed the result of the war? The incredible story of Enigma will be told in the 6th and final program of The Secret War next week.